and welcome to ThePrint softcover. Today we have with us Ravindra Rathee. We are going to be discussing his first book, True to Their Salt, The British Indian Army and an Alternate History of Decolonization. It is a HarperCollins publication. Ravindra has worked as a banker for 20 years and was a journalist before. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Suchet, and thank you for inviting me.
Of course. So I recently read the book and a few thoughts came to my mind. Firstly, that the book dives into the contributions made by the Indian soldiers of the British Indian Army in both the expansion and downfall of the British Empire. With detailed research and use of primary resources, the book tells the story of the British Raj from the perspective of Indian soldiers, an aspect that has largely been ignored in popular literature, especially on colonial history. Rathee argues that the Indian Army was the main fulcrum through which Britain ensured its empire in India. Not studying its role and of the Indian soldiers who served in it then provides an incomplete understanding of empire. But true to their salt, Ravindra fills this gap in the literature. So Ravindra, I'd like to begin by asking you, what is the central theme regarding the Indian soldiers who served in the British Indian Army that you want readers to imbibe from this book?
Thank you, Suchet. So the central theme is that the British Empire, that is the empire from mid-18th century onwards, was really founded on the strength of the British Indian Army in Asia, which was also known as English barrack in the Oriental Seas. And that was a consequence of the limited pool of recruits that Britain could mobilize from the British Isles. Their population was very small in mid-18th century and continues to be even today compared to India. So Indian soldiers played a decisive role in the expansion of British Empire once they lost North America and once the slavery was kind of officially banned, but it did continue through part of the sort of late 18th and 19th century. This was achieved at a very little extra cost to the British Exchequer, because the army in India, which is both the white soldiers and Indian soldiers, they were paid by the Indian Exchequer. That obviously had a decisive impact on the global reach of the British Empire and its ability to project power across the globe, which no other power, I would argue, came close, except perhaps America in the last century and today. But to have that expansion and to have that global reach in terms of military capacity in 18th and 19th century, when the technology was not as superior as today, ships did not sail as fast, there were no airplanes. To have that capacity was really a gift that Britain achieved by the control of Indian empire. So that is the first part of their importance to the British Empire. And the second part is that the Indian soldiers obviously ensured that Britain retained control of India for 200 years. And eventually, when the British could not rely on this Indian army and on the loyalty of the Indian soldiers, they also granted India independence. So it starts with the Indian soldiers, how Britain became first a preferred employer of Indian soldiers in India, i.e. the East India Company. I use the word Britain for both EIC and the Crown, and eventually the exclusive employer of Indian soldiers in the subcontinent. And it ends when that relationship, the loyalty was in doubt during the Second World War.
So as you talk about the British Indian Army and how it was essential for them to project power abroad and domestically, but in the sort of larger narrative of things, it's always attributed to the British Navy and sort of their officers in London sitting perhaps in Whitehall or there and scheming these sort of plans. No one really talks about the role that these soldiers played. Why do you think that's been the case?
Yes. So let me at the outset set out the Navy. Obviously, the English Navy was a predominant force for over 2 centuries. There are two elements linked to the British Indian Army that I mentioned earlier in terms of the overall British military power. Firstly, because the Indian Army did not cost the British Exchequer extra, they were able to save and focus on building up a strong navy, which is a very capital-intensive part of the military forces. So that allowed them to achieve that. And secondly, you could have a wonderful navy and you could reach to different parts of the world, but unless you have boots on the ground, you could not retain that territory. The Indian soldiers.
Sorry to cut you. Is this also why you call them like the strategic reserve, the Indian soldiers as the strategic reserve of the...
Correct. So the Indian Army was the strategic reserve for the British Empire. Wherever the empire's interests were threatened, they could deploy Indian soldiers, and the location was also very strategic for this garrison. At the confluence of Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea, and going to East Asia. So those are the two elements. The Navy definitely was powerful, but investment in Navy was facilitated by having lower cost in terms of maintaining a global army, which did not cost British Exchequer. And in terms of numbers, it is very interesting that the number of Indian soldiers as part of the overall soldiers under British arms, that includes Home Army, that includes armies stationed outside Britain and India. The Indian soldiers comprised more than 50% before 1858, and just a little less than 50% after 1858. So that gives you a flavor of the numbers that were involved in the military power of Britain. Obviously, there were exceptions during the First and Second World War, when they entered a total war and the recruitment from the British Isles had to be expanded, and obviously the conflict against Napoleon, when again they had to hire a significantly large army. But even that army, almost 20 to 25% of the army fighting Napoleon in Europe in early 19th century was non-English. So they were Greeks, African soldiers, and various other ethnicities.
Right. So your book also looks at the theme of decolonization from the perspective of Indian soldiers, something that has received scant attention. You state that the role of Indian soldiers in achieving independence of India has been ignored by the larger political narrative in both India and Britain. Could you unpack this sort of argument for us, and why do you feel that this contribution has been ignored?
Yeah. So I start with the premise that both colonization and decolonization are strategic phenomena. They are not political participative events or processes. It is about the domination of a group of men over another group of people far away from their own territory. And the book proves that that's how the empire started in mid-18th century. But in 20th century, essentially what happened is, in summary, what happened was that throughout the Second World War, the control that British had over the British Indian Army, over Indian soldiers, was significantly loosened. And it was loosened on a couple of fronts. One, a number of Indian officers obtained commission because there were not enough white officers that could be found to manage a 2.5 million army. So by the end of the war, there were about 15,000 Indian commissioned officers with proper field experience. This number, to contrast it with what it was at the beginning of the war in 1939.
So this is by the end of the war?
This is at the end of the war.
This is by the end? Okay.
End of the Second World War. And the number of Indian officers, Indian commissioned officers before the war in 1939 was about 300. So the Indian officers, the Indian commissioned officers, had a significantly large proportion of the British Indian Army at the end of the Second World War. And secondly, during the Second World War, because of the efforts of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose and INA, a degree of doubt was created in the mind of the rest of the soldiers as well. And when those soldiers started coming back to India in late 1945 and 46, and when the British Raj in India made the mistake of trying the three officers, Dhillon, Shahnawaz, and Sehgal at Red Fort, that was really straining the relationship between the British officers and the Indian soldiers. And slowly, if you read the intelligence reports at that time, there was significant amount of communication between the Commander-in-Chief in India, Auchinleck, Viceroy Wavell, India Office, India Secretary in London, and the Prime Minister, that reveals that the Indian army could no longer be relied upon if there was a mass insurrection against British, which British earlier always had the confidence. They were able to crush even the 1942 Quit India movement brutally because they relied on this army. But in late 1945 and 1946, they lost that confidence. And when the naval mutiny happened, that was literally the last nail in the coffin. The sort of leaders of the Raj in London, they were slow in going up the learning curve in terms of what exactly is happening in India. But the naval mutiny drove home the point that time has come, and a number of Indian provincial, a number of English provincial governors send messages to the Viceroy and also to the Commander-in-Chief in India, saying that they are very worried because a number of English bureaucrats and officers are asking for passages back home. One central provincial governor said that he's reminded of the mutiny of 1857, when a number of Indian soldiers and battalions who were otherwise very loyal suddenly rose up in revolt and killed their officers. So there was real fear as to what might unfold in today's situation. And if that unfolds, what would be the consequence for the white population in India? And they did not want to test that. It is to the credit of British that they are practical when it comes to dealing with these situations, unlike French, who really fought a very brutal war in Algeria in 60s and early 70s, and had to be really thrown out from there at the significant cost of human life, both Algerian and French. So
essentially, you're making 2 or 3 points here. That one, there was a rise of the commissioned Indian officers in the ranks that contributed to a sort of slow change in attitude of the army. Secondly, you're saying that there was a major distrust and a gulf which increased within the sort of Indian sepoys who served in the army towards the British. And this all sort of came together in the naval mutiny, and which then made the British realize that it's time for us to leave. Is that basically the essence of the point?
Correct. So in one of the chapters, which is trust deficit, I deal with 3 main instruments of control of the Indian soldiers or Indian army by the British. One of them was to maintain the command and control structure of the army in European hands. So Indians from sort of late 18th century onwards were never allowed to attain a commissioned role. We had these, in Jamadars and Subedars, but they were literally in no man's land. They were not sergeants, but they were not officers, and they had no field or command experience. So to keep the command and control of the Indian army in the European hand was one of the critical way in which British Indian army was kept under control by EIC and the Raj. The second was that they always supplied inferior weapons to Indian soldiers compared to European soldiers who served in India in case of an insurgency. They did not provide them any artillery. They kept them away from artillery till late 1930s. There was a light artillery on the mule back, but otherwise heavy artillery was always kept in European hands. And third was to exploit the religious differences between Hindus, Muslims, and other ethnic differences between various castes and groups. Now, if you see in 1857, the religious and ethnic differences were overcome by the Bengal Army soldiers. Hindus and Muslims united, and they were able to fight under one flag. They were also able to overcome the inferior weapons because they got control of Delhi was a very significant munitions depot, and they obtained control of that. One thing that they lacked at that time was officers who had sufficient command experience. And it's very clear if you read any narrative of 1857 that a proper leadership of the army was a crisis that kind of literally unfolded from day one. So you have, Mirza Jawan Bakht. I think initially Bahadur Shah Zafar appointed him as the leader of the army, but he was not up to the task. He was then sacked. And then another officer from Meerut who was I think a subadar of the cavalry. He was appointed as the leader of the Delhi rebel soldiers, but even he did not have an experience of more than leading a platoon, and that's why you see the impact of that, and that's why that rebellion failed. In 1945, starting from 1939 to 1945. All these three barriers were effectively broken. The most significant one, which was not broken in 1857, which is Indians actually having command and field experience, was broken finally in the Second World War. And you see that chapter traces how there is literally a parallel struggle for independence going on from 1900 onwards in the leadership of the military. And that was the critical transformation that had to be achieved. A nation cannot be sovereign if its army is not loyal to its leadership and it's under its control. And from 1900 onwards, there were some leaders who understood it clearly. Jinnah was one of them. Sir Chotu Ram was one of them. And that campaign to let Indians be commissioned in the officer rank of the British Indian Army runs for about 40% with very little impact, because British were so keen to retain this control in their own hands, as opposed to civil services, which they allowed Indians to actually reach officer level and even be superior to white Europeans. The first civil servant actually was actually hired in 1860s, as long back as then. And from the beginning of 20th century, you had provincial legislatures, even if with limited franchise. And then obviously in 1935, you had the central legislature as well. So there were massive progresses that were made on the executive, bureaucracy, and even in legislature. But the British never wanted to let their control over the army, the commissioned rank of the army, go away. And the Indians who understood it, on the other side, asked for it and campaigned for it. So that is a parallel struggle for independence that goes on between 1900 till 1939 with little effect. But the circumstances forced British during the Second World War, because they could not find even sufficient officers, even in white officers, even in Australia, that they had to hire Indian officers in commissioned ranks. And that meant that the composition of the army looked totally different by the end of it. So
just to move to the second part of the question, why do you think this narrative or this sort of contribution has been ignored, largely both in Britain and India? It's not sort of a mainstream argument that ever comes around. Right.
I would say it's it is not a comfortable narrative for the colonial power and the reason they wanted to avoid it, that's why they responded to the 1946 situation as it was unfolding. And once it was clear that British had that they were really sincere this time in 1946 to leave India, that provided them a degree of safety. But even then, they were very keen to get out of India no matter what. So they literally washed their hands in 1947. That led to this partition and massacre and riots and all of that. So it is a very uncomfortable thought. They wanted to leave on good terms. And broadly, because of their recognition of the situation, their correct assessment, and Auchinleck, I would say, to a great extent, was the commander-in-chief was to a great extent responsible for this assessment to be understood by the leadership in London. They had no interest to sort of go deep in it and to say that it was fear that was the reason why such a powerful imperial structure withdrew from India. That's understandable. And in India, with the same logic, the Congress leaders and others who came to power after 1947, they would be keen to emphasize their own roles as well. And their struggle, as we know, had started pretty much early in the 20th century, but with very little impact on the hold of British Empire on India. Their last their last push of 1942 was very brutally crushed. Once things changed, they had no interest in undermining their own contribution and efforts. That's the only thing I could think of, but otherwise I did not write those books or those narratives. It's very difficult to surmise what leads people to sort of push one particular narrative. You can only present your own side of it, and then let people make the judgment.
So perhaps both narratives of political convenience on both sides led to this sort of being kept under the surface, perhaps. We could.
Correct. Yeah. It's very ambiguous why British Empire ended in India in 1947, while Britain fought such a brutal war in Kenya throughout 1950s, killing and raping and maiming thousands of Kenyans, in trying to crush the Mau Mau rebellion. At the same time, they fought a war in Malaysia. Forget about 1947. There was a YouGov poll done in 2014, and 1/3 of the British population who voted thought it'll be good to have an empire. And this is, so many, almost more than half a century.
This is in 2014?
2014. It's mentioned in my book in the sort of beginning of chapter 10. And even today, there's a big debate going on in UK about whether empire was a force for good or not, what empire achieved. And, the narrative around Indian independence in particular is very ambiguous. It's almost like, after the Second World War, the empire was getting very expensive. Well, what expense did you have? India provided, firstly,
it covered its own costs in a way.
It covered its own cost. When you look at the cost, when you look at the defense budget of UK, you would be surprised to know that the defense budget of UK actually expanded, UK, i.e. the British Isles, and the central government in London. It actually expanded after Indian independence during the Cold War, because finally they had to fund it from their own resources. The percentage of GDP that was spent on defense before Indian independence was not much different from what they're spending today. And today, obviously they're second, third rate or at best second rate power. But at that time, they were a predominant global power. And when you compare that to the percentage of revenues of Indian Exchequer, almost 50% of Indian Exchequer went to the maintenance of this army. Then that gives you an understanding of how costly it was for Indians to pay for this instrument, which ensured their own subjection, and how cheap it was for UK to maintain this global presence and this global force.
They had to then cover the deficit from their own pockets after 47.
Correct. Correct. They had to cover it from their own pockets. And till 47, there was significant bureaucrats, civil servants. They got inflated salaries in India. They had a number of businesses which subsequently are now held by some, Indian newspapers, rubber, tea, plantations, so on and so forth. So there were a number of assets that they had in India, which they had to give up. So, I don't know. It's very difficult to understand what's so expensive about something that's kind of paying for itself. And there was significant amount of contribution from India that was made during the First World War in monetary terms as a quote unquote gift to the mother country. 100 million, that translates in today's value in tens of billions, if not hundreds. The figures I mentioned in my book again, that hadn't changed. So that is a very ambiguous narrative. But when you start with the premise that colonization and decolonization are strategic phenomena, i.e., they are achieved by force and they are reversed by force, that leads you to the next corollary, which is the British Indian Army is the main instrument that was holding that empire, that Raj together, not only in India, but providing them this global reach. And then you focus on that particular instrument, and it's very clear about how this empire came about in India and how it disintegrated, not disintegrated, how it reversed in 47.
These are amongst the first few paragraphs of your argument in the book, that strategic phenomena, and then that then the army is the instrument of expansion and downfall. But
Correct.
Talking about World War I, as you just mentioned, recently there was a discovery of 320,000, I think, soldiers from Punjab who served in World War I, whose records until now were unknown. I'm not sure if you read this. This was found out last year, and basically these records were lying in a basement of the Lahore Museum, and then researchers from the UK found it, and then slowly they've started publishing where these soldiers came from and who they were, and trying to connect to their now families, which is hard because it's been generations since World War I. So I just wanted to ask, beyond just the contribution of the Indian army to the expansion and downfall of empire, why do you think, as a larger narrative, the role of, say, soldiers from the colonies and the subcontinent specifically has been largely ignored in their service in World War I, in between World War II? Your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I would say that it initially, after the First World War and even after the Second World War, obviously the generation that lived through those events in Britain had a better knowledge and awareness of what was the contribution of these soldiers. But as that generation became old and new politicians came and new bureaucrats, and that then I think in a world that was heading towards decolonization, uncertainty, and Britain had to look for its own position forward in this new world, I think that led to a kind of amnesia about the contribution of the colonial soldiers, and especially Indian soldiers, towards the Great British victory in First and Second World War. Yeah, that would be my premise. And I forgot your question.
No, I was basically asking you that, why do you think the service of those from the colonies, specifically the subcontinent, but then World War I and World War II, is largely just ignored? And it's what you allude to as collective amnesia, and now perhaps things are trying to be changed with more research and studies coming out.
Correct. Yes, yeah. So I did note this records that came up in Lahore recently, and I think that's important that we do remember these soldiers, because they had a central contribution in Britain's position in the world today. No matter how damaging the current politicians in last couple of years are to their own country, they have achieved a status which is kind of unique in the world in terms of their reach, the English language, and actual physical population of Australia, New Zealand, and the North American continent. So India played a significant role in it. In fact, it is the lack of understanding of how Britain was able to play this significant role that had led them to these recent problems, where they thought that they could replicate that more than half a century back of reach, of achievement, of effect in the global committee of nations, without realizing that that is not possible, because it was a unique circumstance at that time, because Britain held India as a colony for 200 years, which was a very large, it's a large subcontinent, and all the resources of that subcontinent were at the disposal of the rulers of empire in London, and that is not replicable today. India is a sovereign, independent nation. You can have trade relations and treaties, but that cannot replicate what existed earlier. So that led to this, especially some politicians got sidetracked, and I would say almost confused about how, by getting out of European Union and reaching out to the world, they could replicate the glories of empire. That is not to say that Britain cannot achieve its potential in today's world. It can, but the premise need to be understood correctly. There was something unique about this country, and the fundamental underlying factor behind that uniqueness for almost 2 centuries from mid-18th onwards was the fact that they held India and its resources at their disposal. And coming back to
So
the
that's a very
sort of
interesting point you just made about Brexit and sort of misunderstandings of the role of India as the jewel of the empire.
correct. And as as the sort of apologist of empire, Neil Ferguson himself writes, and I quote him somewhere, that India was not just a jewel in the empire; it was literally a diamond mine. It was an inexhaustible reserve of military human resources for the British Empire, which they could never achieve on their own. And I've looked at the demographics of Britain compared to France, compared to India, and France was a very large country in terms of population compared to England during the Napoleonic Wars in 18th century. Only in 1900s could England actually match French population. And at that time, when the productive capacities of different economies did not massively differ, and certainly in Europe, they did not differ massively, your power lied on the number of people that you had within your region. Russia was a great power because it had a large population compared to England and France and so on and so forth. There was something very unique, which this country, unfortunately, has not studied well in schools. People do realize when they go to university and do their own research, but by the time it's a bit late. Some people never read as a consequence, and politicians especially have little time to read, and they end up making these blunders. So that's my thinking about it.
And just before we run out of time, I'd like to ask you, I read somewhere that first the book started as a sort of personal sort of account. You wanted to tell the story of your grandfather who served in the British Indian Army, but now it became a much larger story about the role of the British Indian Army for empire in expansion, downfall, and everything included how they structured their payments, command and control, and everything in between. So how did this sort of transition happen, or was it just through research you were like, it can't just be one story?
Yes. So you're right. Initially, it started as my research into my grandfather's war records. He sadly passed away in '95, and as a child, I heard stories from him about his war experience, and I was very keen to uncover that myself and find out a bit more, especially when I came to UK. But as you mentioned, that the records of service records are very patchy, very thin. And because of I don't want to spell it out during the talk. Let the readers read it themselves. Because of his unexpected end of his service, which I cover, I think, in chapter 2 of the book, he was not entitled to the pension after the war immediately. So for about 1 or 2 decades, he did not get his pension. And then some, later on with the new records. So even the documents that I have are basically, I think, are recreated in '60s by the Indian Army and the Indian ex-soldiers board. So I found a little bit, but I could not make much headway. But I started reading more and more generally about the British Indian soldiers. About their experiences, what they, how they served in this army, which was controlled by foreigners, and then blended it with the experience of my grandfather, because he was a very intelligent, very driven man, and he had a great influence on me. And I tried to unpick that. And his personal story, in a way, is also the story that I mention at a larger level in this book, and that just goes on to show at another level how significant and important this British Indian Army was for India, for Britain, and for the whole world.
Yeah, I think you interweave those eras quite magnificently. There are sort of two parallels, and then they sort of connect everywhere.
Thank you, Sujay.
So thank you so much for joining us, Ravindra, and we hope that everyone gets a copy and reads the book very soon. It's truly a fascinating argument, and more people should engage with it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Suchet. Have a good day.